As practitioners of the Nichiren Shōshū School, the only orthodox heir to Nichiren Daishōnin's teaching, our faith and practice are based on Dai Gohonzon. Dai Gohonzon, which Nichiren Daishōnin himself defined as the Kanjin no Onzon, or Onzon of the contemplation of the mind, or Onzon of introspection, the materialization of the principle of Ichinen Sanzen, 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought. It therefore seemed to me that knowledge of this 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought principle was of obvious importance. Now, it appears that our understanding of the matter is extremely superficial to the point of not allowing us to fully appreciate the opportunity we have to practice with faith in the Gohonzon of Nichiren Daishōnin, transmitted by the Nichiren Shōshū. Of course, everyone knows the composition of the 3,000, 10 realms, multiplied by 10 realms, multiplied by 10 thus and multiplied by 3 worlds. However, what is the link connecting these elements together? What really is the principle of 3,000 in a single thought? What does it have to do with the Gohonzon? I will attempt to answer these questions using the writings of Nichiren Daishōnin, the successive high priests and the Tendai masters. Of course, my explanations can only be inadequate in view of the depth of this principle. However, they may have the advantage, and this is their objective, of giving us a little better understanding of what we practice, which I also hope will improve our discourse when we talk to others about Buddhism. In any case, even if we understand nothing of the doctrine of 3,000 in a single thought, in the treatise on the Onzon of introspection, Nichiren Daishōnin writes, "For those who do not know 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought, the Buddha showed great compassion and wrapped this pearl in these 5 ideograms which he hung around the necks of the infantile beings of the end of the Dharma." Elsewhere, in the same treatise, he writes, "The causal practices of the revered Shakya and their virtuous effects are present in the 5 characters of Myoho Renge Kyo." In other words, even without understanding much about it, from the moment we chant Daimoku with faith in the Gohonzon, we become Buddha in this body. The Life of Zhiyi. The doctrine of 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought was first presented in the 5th volume of the Great Cessation-and-Contemplation by the Chinese Buddhist monk Zhiyi with these words: "The mind contains 10 Dharma realms, a Dharma realm also contains 10 Dharma realms, which makes 100 Dharma realms. A realm containing 30 kinds of worlds, 100 Dharma realms give 3,000 kinds of worlds. These 3,000 are present in the heart of a thought. If there is no mind, then there is no point in going any further. If there is even a little mind, then it contains 3,000. We call this phenomenon the inconceivable object." More than a theory, 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought is in fact Zhiyi's personal experience of practice, recorded by his disciple Zhang and Guanding. Let's look at how Zhiyi arrived at this ultimate teaching of Buddhism. Zhiyi, whose secular name was Chen Din, was born in 538 during the long reign of Emperor Wu of the Liang dynasty, which occupied southern China. In the north, this was around the time when the Wei divided into the Eastern Wei and the Western Wei, 534, and entered a period of war. In 549, Emperor Wu was overthrown by Ho Jin, 503-552, who enthroned Emperor Wen of the Wei dynasty and had him assassinated 2 years later. In 552, Xiao Yi overthrew Ho Jin and became Emperor Yuan. His reign did not last long, however, as 2 years later, in 554, he too was overthrown by the army of the Western Wei. After such changes in power, the Yuan emperor was executed. Zhiyi was 17 at the time. He was serving in the Yuan imperial government at the request of his father, a Liang official. Faced with this spectacle of incessant and disastrous warfare, Zhiyi tried to seek eternal peace in the Buddhist world by becoming a monk, but was unable to obtain his parents' permission. However, after their death, he finally persuaded his elder brother, who was opposed to the idea, and was ordained a novice at the age of 18. At the age of 20, he received the 250 perfect precepts and became a monk. Meet Huisi. It is said that at the age of 23, Zhiyi visited the great master Nan Yue Huizi, 515-577, who was staying at Mount Disu in Guangzhou province, and underwent 8 years of teaching under his guidance, attaining enlightenment, the preparatory stage for lotus samadhi. Samadhi is a state of equanimity in which the intellect goes beyond its normal function of discrimination, detaching a person from their physical body. In this state, neither time nor space, which are a creation of our mind, exist anymore. When they met, Huizi said to Zhiyi, "Once, we listened to the same Dharma flower on the sacred mountain. Pursued by the residual link, The past repeats itself and, having listened together to the Lotus Sutra on the sacred Eagle Mount, pursued by the causality of past lives, you have once again come to me. This episode, which later became famous, is known as Listening Together on the Sacred Mountain. During these 8 years, Zhiyi certainly studied many Buddhist concepts, which he then theorized under the guidance of Huizi. Activities under the Chen dynasty. In 568, the time came for Zhiyi and Huizi to part ways. An access road to Mount Nanyue and Hangzhou province had been opened, so Huizi, who had wanted to do so for some time, headed for Nanyue. Huizi's parting words to Zhiyi were as follows. I had wanted to go to Nanyue for a long time, but unfortunately I had no one to whom I could entrust the Dharma. You have grasped this doctrine, so to speak, and you correspond well to my wishes. Thanks to you, understanding of the Buddha's Dharma will never cease. You must therefore take over from me. I am now transmitting my Dharma to you. Adapt yourself to the predispositions, transmit the Dharma lamp and educate beings. Do not be the one to put an end to the succession. Huizi expected Zhiyi, who had links with the country of Chen, to make his mark in that country. So Zhiyi went to Zhanye, now Nanjing, the capital of the Chen, with around 30 companions. He subsequently enjoyed great renown in the Chen dynasty for 8 years before entering Mount Tiantai, with notable activities including lectures on the title of the Lotus Sutra, Myoho Renge Kyo, the Treatise of Great Wisdom and the Dharma Gate of Progressive Meditation. Entering Mount Tiantai, Zhiyi was affected by the loss of several loved ones and received the news that Buddhism had been banned by Emperor Wu of the Northern Zhou in 574. He also meditated seriously on the fact that, despite the training of many disciples, the number of those who truly acquired the Dharma was gradually diminishing. Faced with this combination of factors, he felt the need to rededicate himself to asceticism, both for his own spiritual development and for the teaching of others. Despite opposition from the emperor, bureaucrats and other followers who admired him, he decided to enter Mount Tiantai in 575. On entering Mount Tiantai, Zhiyi engaged fervently in meditation on Hua Ting Peak, the highest peak on Mount Tiantai. It was here that he acquired an awakening to the essence of the Dharma of the One True Truth, which can be considered the foundation of the Three Truths and the 3,000 in a single thought, which he later systematized. The corpus of Buddhism in general, and Tendai in particular, is subdivided into the door of the doctrinal aspect and the door of the contemplation of the mind. Their purpose is to obtain a correct understanding of the true principle and then to practice it with a view to achieving enlightenment. As for the door to the doctrinal aspect, in other words the exposition of Buddhist theories, Zhiyi taught the profound meaning of the Lotus Sutra and the words and phrases of the lotus. The profound meaning of the lotus is the interpretation of the 5 characters, Myoho Renge Kyo, of the title of the Lotus Sutra from the perspective of the 5-fold mysterious meaning, name, substance, intention, application and teaching. Through the name, Zhiyi explains the meaning of the title of the sutra, in this case the name Myoho Renge Kyo. The study of the substance demonstrates the truth that this sutra develops as the basis of the teachings, namely, the true aspect of the dharmas. The intention is the search for the causes and effects of the practice of Shakyamuni, the Buddha who taught the Lotus Sutra. Here, Zhiyi explains the causes and effects of awakening in Shakyamuni Buddha's distant past, thus refuting the notion of awakening first in this life. The application represents the means of removing doubt and instilling faith in the Lotus Sutra and beings in order to save them. These are the Buddha's 2 wisdoms, circumstantial and true. The teaching situates the place of the Lotus Sutra in the preaching and teaching given by the Buddha during his life. The words and phrases of the lotus is an interpretation of passages from the Lotus Sutra from 4 points of view, the causal interpretation, the doctrinal interpretation, the original and ephemeral interpretation and the interpretation according to the contemplation of the mind. The causal interpretation is based on the relationship between beings and the Buddha. Beings seek the Buddha and, in return, the Buddha responds to beings. Doctrinal interpretation is based on the 4 teachings of the doctrine according to Zhiyi, the basket's teachings, the common teachings, the particular teachings and the perfect teaching. The fundamental and ephemeral interpretation is based on the 2 facets of the Lotus Sutra, the ephemeral doctrine, the first 14 chapters, which preach the abandonment of the 3 vehicles, the vehicle of the listeners, the vehicle of the awakened by conditions and the vehicle of the bodhisattvas to adopt the single vehicle of the Buddha, and the fundamental doctrine, the last 14 chapters, which preach the abandonment of the near to adopt the far, the near being the notion of Shakyamuni becoming Buddha for the first time in this life, and where the far is his attainment of Buddhahood in the distant past. Interpretation according to the contemplation of the mind is Zhiyi's own method of interpretation, which goes beyond the superficial interpretation of words and scriptures, and is an interpretation that enables one to personally experience the truth indicated in the sutra, that is, the three truths of emptiness, conditionality and medianity. Once this understanding has been acquired, the practice begins, based on this understanding. The main practices to which Zhiyi devoted himself were cessation and contemplation, which are themselves subdivided into small cessation and contemplation and great cessation and contemplation. To these main practices are added auxiliary practices. For example, in the Nichiren Shōshū, the main practice is the chanting of the Daimoku, Shodai, while the auxiliary practice is Gongyo. The auxiliary practices in the Tendai are called the 25 means, common to the small and great cessation and contemplation, and divided into 5 categories of 5 subjects to be cultivated or mastered in order to prepare oneself for a serious asceticism of contemplation. 1. Meet 5 conditions, respect the precepts, prepare a minimum of food and clothing, live in a quiet and isolated place, put an end to all worldly responsibilities and approach a good friend. 2. Renounce sensual desires of form, sound, smell, taste and touch, by restricting and controlling them. 3. Rejecting the 5 obstacles of greed, anger, laziness, shame and doubt. 4. Regulating one's diet, sleep, body, breath and mind. 5. 5 additional practices concerning desires, diligence, full awareness, skillful wisdom and a single mind. Cessation and contemplation are concerned with the 3 truths, emptiness, conditionality and medianity, but approached in a different way according to the small cessation and contemplation and the great cessation and contemplation. Zhiyi is said to have revealed the small cessation and contemplation to his elder brother, who was in a state of depression. The elder brother practiced the method of adjusting body and mind described in the book, overcame his fear of death, recovered both physically and spiritually, and lived life to the full. The small cessation and contemplation is also called the progressive cessation and contemplation, because it is done in successive stages. First, we contemplate emptiness by rejecting the notion of existence and arriving at a state of conceptlessness. Next, conditionality is contemplated by recognizing verbal expression and thus eliminating attachment to emptiness. Finally, we contemplate medianity by synthesizing the notions of emptiness and conditionality in order to eliminate attachment to one or the other. I'll take an example I've used before, that of a bottle. A bottle on a table comes into our field of vision. Instantly, we become aware of it and, from then on, for us, it exists. If we apply ourselves to analyzing its nature, we realize that if it is filled with water, we call it a bottle of water. If it is filled with wine, we call it a wine bottle. If it's empty, we call it an empty bottle. If we drop it and it breaks, it's no longer a bottle. If we stick a candle in its neck, we call it a candlestick. If we put a flower in it, we call it a vase. If we say no, it's just a bottle with a flower in it, we're still attached to the notion of existence. If we pick up the bottle and hit someone with it, it becomes a weapon. This leads to the conclusion that the bottle as such has no nature. In the sutras, we find the same kind of example with fire. When we feed a fire with logs, it is a fire of logs. If we feed it with straw, we have a straw fire. I've used 2 examples, but this principle applies to everything we become aware of. Finally, by contemplating the emptiness of the notion of a bottle, a fire or any other thing in this way, we come to reject the notion of the existence of a bottle, a fire or any other thing, and arrive at a state of absence of concepts, of absence of nature. This is analytical emptiness. However, if we stop at this notion of non-existence, we fall into the nihilism of the small vehicle, in which nothing exists. Now, as the sutras say, if you feed a fire with logs, you get the name log fire. In the same way, if you fill an empty bottle with water, you get the name water bottle. The expression "you get the name" is very important. Once we have understood that things are simply a name that we have given to various elements that have come together according to causes and conditions, we then contemplate conditionality by recognizing the verbal expression log fire, bottle of water, and that of all the other concepts, thus eliminating the attachment to emptiness. Finally, by synthesizing the 2 truths of emptiness and conditionality, integrating one and the other without becoming attached to them, we arrive at the truth of the middle way. If we take the example of a glass half full, we can say 1. That it is half full, 2. That it is half empty, 3. That it is both full and empty, 4. That it is neither empty nor full. This is the tetralemma of discernment used by Nagarjuna, which Zhiyi reused. The great cessation and contemplation reflects Zhiyi's thought brought to perfection. It is sudden and perfect cessation and contemplation. In fact, the contemplation of the three truths does not take place in stages, as in progressive cessation and contemplation, but all at once. The three truths merge in our thought and we then obtain triple contemplation in our mind. Unlike the medianity of the small cessation and contemplation, which synthesized emptiness and conditionality, in the vision of the triple truth in one heart, in the great cessation and contemplation emptiness includes conditionality and medianity as they are, conditionality includes emptiness and medianity as they are, and medianity includes emptiness and conditionality as they are. This is the sudden and perfect cessation and contemplation. This sudden and perfect cessation and contemplation is the hypertemporal, hyper-rational logic of synthesis characteristic of Chinese Buddhism. It is based on the perfect teaching of the Lotus Sutra, the thought of triple contemplation that grasps everything as a whole. The great cessation and contemplation has another notable feature: it teaches the 4 types of samadhi relating to static meditation, cessation, as well as the 10 objects and 10 vehicles or 3,000 in a single thought relating to dynamic meditation, contemplation. As for the 10 objects and 10 vehicles, the 10 objects represent the objects of contemplation and the 10 vehicles designate the methods of contemplation. The whole combination is a method of contemplation comprising 100 different contemplations. 3,000 in a single thought is the method of contemplation of the 3,000 characteristics of the 10 dharmas realms, the 3 worlds and the 10 thus visualized in one's mind. In the great cessation and contemplation, elements such as the 10 objects, the 10 vehicles and the 3,000 realms are taught from the sudden and perfect point of view, or non-temporal synthesis. They are therefore not systematized as a scale of progression. However, this does not mean that, in practice, there is no temporal dimension and no graduation. As a philosophy and teaching, the vision of the world according to the 10 objects and 10 vehicles, 3,000 in a single thought is extremely complex and complete. For this reason, nowadays, certain elements can only be practiced in part. Here is an overview of the Great Cessation and Contemplation, in accordance with the titles of its chapters. General Idea. The first chapter, devoted to the general idea, deals with the 6 identities and the 4 types of samadhi. The 6 identities set out the ascetic process of a bodhisattva practicing the perfect teaching of the Lotus Sutra, that is, the practice of the non-duality of things, divided into 6 degrees. The 6 identities are, the identity of principle, the denominational identity, the identity of contemplation, the identity of analogy, the identity of fractional reality and the ultimate identity. 1. Identity of principle, degree in which one has not yet heard of the correct Dharma and is not yet aware of Buddha nature. 2. Denominational identity, degree in which one has heard of the Buddha Dharma and understands that one possesses the Buddha nature. 3. Identity of contemplation, degree in which one begins the practice of Tendai meditation and the 6 perfections, that is the perfections of generosity, ethics, patience, application, concentration and wisdom, and undertakes the vision of Buddha nature in one's heart. 4. Analogy identity, the stage in which one has renounced the 2 misguidances of views and thoughts and, thus, purified one's 6 roots and thus obtained superior wisdom, similar to that of the Buddha. 5. Fractional reality identity, degree in which one partially awakens to true wisdom and, as a result, begins to realize Buddha nature. At this stage, 41 of the 42 aberrations of darkness have been eradicated. Only the fundamental darkness remains. 6. Ultimate identity, the final degree of awakening in which one fully realizes Buddha nature. It is the ultimate stage of realizing the state of life of the perfect teaching. These degrees of awakening take place during asceticism, which takes the form of 4 forms of samadhi. Samadhi is a form of meditation during which the mind is concentrated on a single object. The object of concentration may be physical, a metaphysical principle or a transcendental existence. This exercise is usually practiced repeatedly over a long period of time, until the practitioner achieves a concentration of the mind in which he or she realizes principles or visualizes transcendental objects. The first samadhi is permanent sitting concentration, the practitioner enters a quiet room alone and immerses himself in meditation for a period of 90 days. He sits exclusively and only gets up for one meal a day before noon and for natural needs. The second samadhi is permanent walking concentration. It consists of meditation by walking around a statue of Amida Buddha for a period of 90 days, while invoking his name and evoking his image. You walk on the wooden slats between the pillars of the hall, or rest your steps by holding on to hemp ropes suspended from the ceiling, without ever sitting down. The third samadhi is half-walking, half-seated concentration. The practitioner walks around a statue of the Buddha while reciting a sutra and also meditates on the reality of things in a seated posture, legs crossed. The fourth samadhi is neither walking nor sitting concentration, consisting of meditation on reality, in an unspecified posture and for an unspecified period of time. In this neither walking nor sitting concentration, daily life itself is a practice. As there is no fixed period or method of practice, it is not always easy, because you always have to be in touch with the essence that transcends form. There are a number of points to bear in mind here. Firstly, it is impossible to carry out these practices from the outset, without any preparation, hence the 25 preliminary practices, which aim to free the practitioner from all worldly attachments. Secondly, and this is undoubtedly the most important reason why these practices are obsolete today, is that Zhiyi lived in the period of the semblance of the Dharma, whereas we, ordinary beings who have never had any connection with the Buddha's teaching, live in the period of the end of the Dharma. Explanation of the name. We will now continue with another point that Zhiyi addresses in his great Cessation and Contemplation, namely the explanation of the name. In the chapter devoted to the explanation of the name, Zhiyi explains the definition and categorization of the name cessation and contemplation. Firstly, the term cessation and contemplation has three meanings and profiles. There are three types of cessation: cessation of the erroneous activities of the mind, cessation into the truth thanks to wisdom, and clear cessation with regard to the non-stopping of darkness. Similarly, there are three types of contemplation: that which annihilates evil passions through wisdom, that in which wisdom corresponds to truth, and the lucid contemplation with regard to non-contemplation due to darkness. Since the small cessation and contemplation contrasts these three definitions and profiles, they are called relative cessation and contemplation. On the other hand, the great cessation and contemplation based on the perfect teaching and using a vocabulary that transcends this opposition, the cessation and contemplation practice there are called absolute cessation and contemplation. Then, after explaining the aspect of substance and the preparatory means for the practice, which are more or less the same in both the small and the great cessation and contemplation, Zhiyi explains the practice itself. The 10 objects. The main practice of cessation and contemplating is broadly categorized into 10 objects, classified according to the object of contemplation. The meaning of the word object here is taken to mean the 10 types of objects that stand in the way of cessation and contemplating. Specifically, these are the contemplation of aggregates, entries and worlds as objects, evil passions as objects, disease as an object, the appearance of acts as an object, evil passions as objects, illness as an object, the aspect of acts as an object, the work of the devil as an object, contemplation as an object, views as an object, impudence as an object, the two vehicles as an object and Buddhahood as an object. Some of these elements are taught in the small cessation and contemplation. They are taken up again in the great cessation and contemplation and systematized as categories of objects of cessation and contemplation. With the exception of aggregates, entries and worlds as objects, they appear when there is a problem and can occur sequentially or not. The aggregates, entries and worlds as objects represent the first representative object to be contemplated. This is because they are there for all to see. More specifically, these are the 5 aggregates, the 6 objects, the 6 roots and the 6 consciousnesses, that is, the 18 elements that I have already mentioned in Chapter 5 of the videos on my YouTube channel, which, in ordinary people, are impure. Zhiyi defends the idea, based on the consciousness-only doctrine, that the mind creates everything, and that it must therefore be observed first and foremost as the object of consciousness. This method of observation includes the method of contemplation through the 10 vehicles and the method of contemplation of passing circumstances and the objects of the senses. The latter method is taught in the small cessation and contemplation and consists of a method of observation within daily life. The 10 vehicles. We practice cessation and contemplating the 10 objects by means of the 10 vehicles which represent 10 methods of observation. 1. Contemplation of the inconceivable object. 2. Resolution to save all beings. 3. Skillful calming of the mind. 4. Destruction of all attachments. 5. Knowledge of what leads to the realization of the threefold truth and what blocks it. 6. Cultivation of practices and views conducive to awakening. 7. Application of antidotes to eliminate faults. 8. Knowledge of the stages of progression. 9. Indifference to success and adversity. 10. Non-attachment to spiritual realization. Of these 10 methods of practice, the first, contemplation of the inconceivable object, is particularly important. It is an observation that the observed world is beyond conceptual comprehension. One of these methods of observation is the contemplation of 3,000 in a single thought. 3,000 realms in a single moment of thought. 3,000 is the combination of 10 Dharma realms, 3 worlds and 10 thus. The 10 Dharma realms are made up of the 6 paths, hells, hungry spirits, asuras, humans and heaven, the 2 vehicles, auditors and self-awakened, the bodhisattvas and the Buddha. All are produced by the mind. The nature of the mind in these different realms corresponds to being for the 6 paths, emptiness for the 2 vehicles, conditionality for the bodhisattvas and the middle for the Buddha. The observation then focuses on the fact that each realm potentially contains the 10 other Dharma realms. This is called the mutual presence of the 10 realms. In addition, each realms includes 3 worlds, the world of the 5 aggregates, 5 shadows, as components of name and form, the world of beings as living beings and the world of territory as a support. The 10 thuses are the 10 qualities/aspects possessed by each of the above-mentioned realms. More specifically, they are aspect, nature, substance, energy, production, cause, condition, effect, retribution and total equality from origin to end. Total equality from origin to end is the property that everything from appearance to retribution is identical in terms of emptiness, different in terms of conditionality and both at the same time in terms of medianity. It should be noted that the 10 thuses are said to be taught in the chapter of means of the Lotus Sutra, yet in the original Sanskrit there are only 5 thuses, which have been translated as 10 thuses by Kumarajiva. The above is combined by multiplying 10 multiplied by 10, multiplied by 3, multiplied by 10, equals 3,000. Thus, we find that there are these 3,000 realms in every mind. The single thought of the present moment and the 3,000 realms that symbolize all phenomena are neither anterior nor posterior to each other. The single thought does not engender the 3,000 realms, any more than the 3,000 realms reside in the single thought. We note that this analysis is subtle and inconceivable, that is, that it goes beyond and escapes all conceptual recognition. Another method of observing the inconceivable object is the 4-clause supposition, also called the tetralemma of discernment that we saw earlier. This is a method derived from Nagarjuna, which considers the objects of the mind as empty, that is, inconceivable, through an analysis of the negation of the 4 types of proposition, A, non-A, both, neither. The Great Cessation-and-Contemplation is written only up to the 7th paragraph of the 7th chapter, concerning the main practice of cessation and contemplation. After that, only the titles, table of contents, are given, and the contents appear only in general terms in the chapter on the general idea and in other chapters. This is not because it is incomplete, but because there seems to have been a desire not to describe the higher levels in detail. At the next conference, I will go into detail about each constituent element of the principle of 3,000 in a single thought.